بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أتل ما أوحي إليك من الكتاب وأقم الصلاة إن الصلاة تنهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر ولذكر الله أكبر والله يعلم ما تصنعون صدق الله العظيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ربي زدني علما وارزقني فهما. Alhamdulillah, last week, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we were talking about things which necessitate sajda sahw, and we mentioned from some of those things, number one is if a person doesn't do the actions of namaz in order, and we gave a few examples of those. Number two, if a person doesn't read the full Surah Fatiha, so even if a ayat or a verse or a word or a letter even of Surah Fatiha was left out, then Sajda Sahw will be necessary. Number three, we said that you should read Surah Fatiha before reading a surah. So if a surah was read first accidentally before Surah Fatiha, then Sajda Sahw will be necessary. We also mentioned that reading loudly is necessary in those prayers where it is necessary to read loud, and reading quietly in those prayers where it is necessary to read quietly. And if somebody reverses this, i.e. he reads loudly in a quiet namaz or he reads quietly in a loud namaz, then we mentioned the details of how much he has to read, in which case sajda sahw will be necessary, and we mentioned many more details along with it. Alhamdulillah, that is what we mentioned last week. So continuing from there, inshallah, today. That number six, the sixth thing that will necessitate sajda sahw is not performing every action calmly. So it is wajib to perform every action calmly in a manner that action is performed where the limbs of the body are motionless. The body parts and the limbs are still and they're not moving. And generally the time frame given for that period where the limbs will become motionless is one tasbih. So in ruku, for example, one subhana rabbiyal azim. It is wajib to be in ruku for the duration of one subhana rabbiyal azim. In sajda, it is wajib to be in the sajda position for one subhana rabbiyal a'la, the duration of one subhana rabbiyal a'la. Similarly, along with these two actions, it is also wajib to perform the qawma and the jalsa in a calm manner. Now what is qawma? Qawma is when you get up from ruku. So you're going to ruku, Sami Allahu liman hamida. When you stand straight, it is also wajib to stand straight in a manner where the limbs are motionless. And generally, again, one tasbih is the time frame given. The actual tasbih that we read there would be Rabbana lakal hamd. Similarly, the jalsa, meaning the sitting between the two sajda, that should also be performed in a calm manner. So some people go sajda, get up and straight away the body parts are still moving and they do the second sajda again. So come back up from the second sajda, sit calmly. Okay, the mustahab dua to read in that position, Rabbi Ghfirli, once in the Faraz namaz, and then go back into the second sajda. So if a person accidentally did not perform these postures in a calm manner, then sajda sahw will become necessary. Number 7, not sitting in the first sitting, the first qadda. So in 4 rakat prayers, the faraz and the sunnat-e muakkada prayers, you have 2 sittings. You have the first sitting and you have the last sitting. So if a person doesn't sit in that first sitting, the first qadda, sajda sahw will be necessary. And the details are as follows. Number 1, if a person remembered that he missed the first sitting after completing the 3rd rakat. So he got straight up directly after the 2nd rakat, he stood up straight for the 3rd rakat, he's read the 3rd rakat as well, then he remembered that he forgot the sitting. Very easy in this scenario, sajda sahw will be necessary at the end. However, number 2 is a person remembers straight away after standing up. So after the 2nd rakat sajda, he was getting up for the third rakat, and then he remembers straight away. As soon as he stood up, he just stood up and he remembers straight away that I've missed the qa'da, I've missed the first sitting. What is the ruling here? So the answer here is, upon remembering, the person will continue standing if he is closer to standing. So upon remembering, he will continue to stand. If he is closer to standing, he will complete the rest of the namaz as usual, and he will perform sajda sahw at the end. Now, what does it mean to be closer to standing? The answer is when the bottom half of the body is straight. So when the knees and the shins are completely straight, even if the back is slightly inclined, as the bottom half, the knees and the shins, if they are straight, then that person is assumed to be closer to standing. So if a person is closer to standing and then he remembers, so it not necessarily has to be stood up all the way. If he is closer to standing, bottom half of the body is straight, then he will continue with the namaz. He's not going to sit back down again. He's going to remain standing. He's going to complete the namaz as usual, read the third rakat, fourth rakat, and sajda sahw will be necessary at the end. Now, just 1 minute if that's okay. Now, the second thing is, if we mentioned the ruling is one should stay standing if he's closer to standing or he stood completely. What if instinctively a person sits back down? Because as soon as he remembered, oh, I forgot the sitting, just instinctively he sits back down. He doesn't remember the fact that he's closer to standing. In this scenario, what he should do is, when he realizes that yes, I was closer to standing, he will stand straight back up again without reading at-tahiyyat. Although he had sat back down again, but originally because he was closer to standing, he will now stand back up without reading at-tahiyyat. He will stand back up. And if he did read at-tahiyyat, although he should have stood back up, he read at-tahiyyat, he will complete his namaz as normal and he'll do sajda sahw at the end. It'll still be fine. And then number 3, if the person was closer to standing, if the person was closer to sitting. So we give the definition of being closer to standing. So what does it mean to be closer to sitting? Is when the bottom half of the body is not straight. So the knees are still slightly bent. Then if he is closer to sitting and he remembers he's missed the first sitting, then he will sit back down and he'll complete the namaz as usual, and sajda sahw will not be necessary. So if he's closer to sitting and he remembers, he'll just sit back down and no sajda sahw will be necessary. Yes. Okay, no problem. Ibrahim, if you can just come here for 1 minute. Just here, or if you turn around actually in Fiqh, just come this way. And just face everybody and sit in the tashahhud position. Okay, just slowly get up. Slowly. Okay, stop. That's still closer to sitting. Carry on. Stop. Knees are still bent, so he'd still be closer to sitting. Even now, still closer to sitting. Slightly more. There. The knees are straight. Just go a bit more back down again. Yep. So knees are bent. You'll see sometimes even though the back is still inclined, is still bent, but as long as the bottom half of the body is straight, he'll be considered closer to standing. Now, is there a difference if this was in the first sitting or if this was in the last sitting? The answer is no. The same ruling would apply in the last sitting as well. So there's 2 scenarios in that sense in the last sitting. One is that after you've read the 4th rakat, you were about to stand up for a 5th rakat directly without reading at-tahiyyat. So if you're closer to sitting, you sit down, no sajda sahw. You're closer to standing, you'll sit back down and you'll do sajda sahw. The same will be if you've actually sat for the sitting on the 4th rakat and accidentally you're about to stand up for a 5th rakat thinking it's your 3rd rakat or something along those lines. Again, if you're closer to sitting, you will sit back down, no sajda sahw. If you are closer to standing, then you will sit back down and do sajda sahw. So in the first scenario, when you're closer to sitting, no sajda sahw. If you're closer to sitting, no sajda sahw. If you're closer to standing, there will be sajda sahw. So just to highlight, जी, ये हमने पिछले हफ्ते बताया था, तो आप पिछले हफ्ते नहीं आए थे, तो मैं बता देता हूँ। ठीक है, ये बिल्कुल इसी पॉइंट पर था कि द डिफरेंस बिटवीन द फर्स्ट एंड लास्ट सिटिंग, दैट्स व्हाट आई वांटेड टू हाईलाइट एनीवे, सो आई विल मेंशन इट अलोंग दैट. What's the difference between the first sitting and last sitting? Remember, we said first sitting is wajib, and the last sitting, anybody remember? Last sitting will be faraz. Okay, so what's the difference between the two? One is faraz, one is wajib. What does that mean? So that means if, for example, the person has omitted the first sitting completely, so like I said, he remembers once he has stood up or he is closer to standing, now he won't sit back down. Now he'll just do sajdah sahw at the end. But in the scenario where a person stands up for a fifth rakat, if he does a sajdah of the fifth rakat, in that fifth rakat he goes into sajdah, what did we say? That namaz becomes invalid because he didn't sit down, because the last sitting is faraz. So if you remember, whilst you're in the fifth rakat, you stood up accidentally, before you go into sajda, you should sit back down again and you'll do sajda sahw. Now where you're saying should you add 2 rakats, that is in the incident where if you sat down and you read at-tahiyyat, then you stood up and you read a fifth rakat, then you will add a sixth rakat. But that's only when you've actually sat down and read at-tahiyyat. If you didn't read at-tahiyyat, then that faraz becomes invalid because the last sitting is faraz. So that's the difference between the faraz of the last sitting and the wajib of the first sitting. That if you've missed it, and how will the last sitting be missed? Once you go into sajda in the fifth rakat, faraz invalid. But if you miss the first sitting, and when will that be classed as missed? Is when you're closer to standing or you stood up, then you'll just do sajda sahw at the end. The namaz won't be invalid. Number 8, what will necessitate sajda sahw? Not reciting at-tahiyyat in both sittings. So one wajib is to actually sit down, the sitting, and in the last rakat, faraz. But one wajib is to actually read at-tahiyyat in the sitting. So some people, they do make this mistake. They say in the sitting and they just silent. So it is also wajib to read the shahud in both sittings, to read at-tahiyyat, the full at-tahiyyat till the end in both sittings. So if a person misses this at-tahiyyat out, even one word, then sajda sahw will be necessary. Number 9, to miss the word as-salam. So we're talking about when you finish your namaz, you complete your namaz, you say assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It is wajib to say both salams. So note what I said. To say the word as-salam, there's 2 things you should know. Number 1, I said to miss the word. I didn't say the action. I'll come back to this. And number 2, I said as-salam. So not assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So the example I'll give to you is a person, he says assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and the second salam he says assalamu, and after he said assalamu, accidentally he passes wind. Now his namaz will be complete because the wajib, what was wajib was to just say assalam, not alaykum wa rahmatullah. That's the first thing. And number 2, I said to miss the word salam. So the actual turning to the right side first and turning to the left side after that, that is sunnat. That isn't wajib. To say assalam, that is wajib. But the actual turning, that is sunnat. Therefore, if one accidentally turns to the left side first, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, now what should he do? He should just do one salam to the right, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. His namaz will be valid, okay? Because the actual action is sunnat, not wajib. Obviously, if somebody did it accidentally, I'm not saying they should do that. Yes. 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 I don't know. Well, they do both salams. The second salam is not clear, or maybe you're just talking about janaza namaz. In janaza, they don't do both salams. So maybe that's where you're thinking. Because in Farz namaz, they do both salams. As far as I remember, they in both salams, they do. Is the janaza namaz you're probably thinking about? Yes. Wajib and sunnat, that wajib, if you omit it, you have to do sajda sahw. And if sunnat, you omit it accidentally, your namaz is valid. You don't even have to do a sajda sahw at the end. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Number 10 is a delay of one posture. So the 10th thing that would necessitate sajda sahw is a delay of one posture. So we mentioned those things which necessitate sajda sahw at the start. So we mentioned that, for example, a delay or to repeat certain things. So now when you repeat certain things, that is also essentially causing a delay of a posture. So the example of this is a person accidentally does 3 sajdas in the first rakat. Instead of doing 2, he accidentally did 3 because he's caused a delay of the next posture, which was the standing and the qiraat, etc. Because he's caused that delay, sajda sahw will be necessary at the end if he does 3 sajdas. Number 2, example. Now, I'm not going to list every single example of causing a delay. I've only listed a few. Number 2, thinking between Surah Fatiha and Surah. So you read غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ Ameen. And now you're thinking, which surah should I read? And remember, we mentioned one posture, the delay of one posture, and we've mentioned this before. What is this duration? Can anybody remember? Tasbih 3 Subhan Rabbiyal A'la. The duration of 3 Subhan Rabbiyal A'las is equal to one posture. So if there is a delay equivalent to this time, then sajda sahw will be necessary. So he غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين Ameen, and now he's thinking, and that duration passes before he starts the surah, sajda sahw will be necessary. So sometimes this happens that you're thinking, what did I read in the first rakat? Or you just completely get confused. There's a long delay, then sajda sahw will be necessary. Number 3, accidentally sitting after the first or third rakat. So if a person accidentally sits after the first rakat thinking it's the second rakat, he accidentally sits after the third rakat thinking it's the fourth rakat, and then he remembers, if there was a delay of how long? 3 Subhana Rabbiyal A'las or more, then sajda sahw will be necessary. If there was a delay of less than 3 Subhana Rabbiyal A'las, then sajda sahw will not be necessary. So he just sat down, immediately remembered, he stood up, and there was less than 3 Subhana Rabbiyal A'la, no sajda sahw. But he sat there and he's thinking, time passes, he stood up now he remembers, sajda sahw will be necessary. And Mufti Rashid Ahmed Saab, he's done a bit of calculating. Okay, he's mentioned that Subhana Rabbiyal A'la, how many letters are there in Subhana Rabbiyal A'la? There are 14 letters in Subhana Rabbiyal A'la. And we said, how many Subhana Rabbiyal A'las for one posture? 3. So 3 times 14? 42. Yes. So 3 times 14 is 42. So 42 letters in at-tahiyyat. Because when a person has sat down after the first rakat, accidentally thinking it's the second rakat, he's going to start reading at-tahiyyatu. So at-tahiyyatu lillahi wa salawatu. If this person, the 42nd letter in at-tahiyyat is at-tahiyyatu lillahi wa salawatu wa tayyibatu assalamu alayka. Assalamu alayka ayyuhan nabiyyu. So the ha in ayyuhan, the ha or the h in ayyuhan is the 42nd letter. So if you read past this, then sajda sahw will be necessary. And if you stood up before this, then there will be no sajda sahw. But remember, very important note, this is when you actually, as soon as you sat down, you started reading, and as soon as you remembered, you stood straight back up. Because remember, the key word we say is the duration of 3 tasbeehs. So if a person, he only read at-tahiyyatu lillahi was salawatu wa tayyibatu, he's only read up to at-tayyibatu, but now he's thinking that is it my first rakat or is it my second rakat? And the duration of 3 tasbeehs passes, even though he's only read up to Assalamu alayka. So he's read before the 42nd letter before this, but he's still thinking. Remember, we will look at it all in total. So it's not just how much you read, it's actually the whole duration. Do you understand? Yeah. So the whole duration will be looked at. So even in other things as well, where we mention that if there's a delay of one posture or 3 tasbeehs, we'll be looking at the time, not necessarily just what's read. So if that time frame is equivalent to the time it takes to say 3 Subhana Rabbiyal A'las, then Sajda Sahw will be necessary. Number 4. Accidentally reading durood in the first sitting in a faraz and sunnat muakkada prayer apart from the 4 sunnat after Jummah. So again, in 4 rakat prayers, you have 2 sittings, the first sitting and the last sitting. In the first sitting, you should only read at-tahiyyat, the full at-tahiyyat. أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله, and stand up. Now, if a person accidentally starts reading durood, then Sajda Sahw will be necessary if he reads up to wa ala ali Muhammad. So if he reads up to the second Muhammad, there are 2 Muhammads in Durood Sharif. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad. So if he reads up to the second Muhammad, then Sajda Sahw will be necessary. If he's read less than this, Allahumma salli ala, then he remembers straight away, he'll stand up, no Sajda Sahw. But he reads up to the second Muhammad, Sajda Sahw will be necessary. And just a note that some scholars, they say it's up to the first Muhammad. So just in case you ever hear this opinion, don't get worried that, oh, I've told the wrong masala, I've heard the wrong masala. There are 2 opinions. Some go for the more precautious opinion. They say up to the first Muhammad, and some say up to the second Muhammad. This is the opinion of my teacher, and it's also my opinion as well. And we said the key thing is in faraz namazes, so 4 rakat faraz is 4 rakat sunnat muakkada prayers as well. So the 4 rakat sunnat before Zohar and the 4 rakat sunnat before Jummah as well, this rule would apply. However, this rule wouldn't apply to the 4 rakat sunnat ghair muakkada. So for example, ghair muakkada is before Asr, before Isha. So if a person accidentally he does it, there's no Sajda Sahw in ghair muakkada prayers. Similarly, if in 4 rakat nafil, you're just reading nafil and 4 rakat, and you accidentally, some people say you can even do it intentionally. So if you do it accidentally, there's no Sajda Sahw. And we said the only exception in the sunnat muakkada area is the 4 rakat sunnat after Jummah. Even though the 4 rakat sunnat after Jummah is sunnat muakkada, if a person reads Durood Sharif in the first sitting, there'll be no Sajda Sahw. So try and take all of that in. It is a lot of detail. Main thing is faraz and sunnat muakkada prayers. If you read up to wa ala ali Muhammad, Sajda Sahw is necessary. And in sunnat ghair muakkada prayers and in nafil prayers, and the only sunnat muakkada prayer is the 4 rakat sunnat after Jummah, and you read Durood Sharif in the first sitting, there is no Sajda Sahw. I think number 5, accidentally making salam early. So for example, the first sitting, you're reading 4 rakats. In the second rakat, it could be any rakat, even after the first rakat, even after the third rakat as well. You've sat down at tahiyyatu, you've read everything, Durood Sharif, dua, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. You've technically finished your namaz, but now you remember. Upon remembering, you will stand up and complete your namaz as normal. The 3 rakats that are left, the 2 rakats that are left, the 1 rakat that is left, do Sajda Sahw at the end, and your namaz is valid. This is as long as you did not do any action that would invalidate your namaz after doing the salam. So Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and you started talking. Then you remembered, then you have to restart the namaz. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, you started talking, you started eating. Okay, eating invalidates the namaz. So anything that invalidates the namaz, you did that and then you remembered, now you have to restart the namaz. If it was before this, then even if you, like I gave example last week of Sajdah Sahw, if a person forgot Sajdah Sahw and then he remembered, you're still doing your tasbih, you're reading Ayatul Kursi, you're still doing Allahu Akbar, Astaghfirullah, Allahumma anta salam, then you remember that I've done salam early, then you will just stand up, complete your namaz and do Sajdah Sahw at the end. And if you guys remember from the masala of the Sajdah Sahw that I mentioned, is there's one exception to doing an action that would invalidate the namaz, that even if you did it, you can still carry on your namaz. Didn't anybody remember? Is if you turn your chest away from the Qibla if you're in the masjid. So if you're in the masjid and you turn your chest away from the Qibla and you're walking out and before you left the masjid you remembered, I've only read one rakat, then you continue your namaz, even though turning the chest away from the Qibla invalidates the namaz, but this is a special exception. So it's basically the same ruling as missing the Sajdah Sahw. So we mentioned this last week. If a person is meant to do Sajdah Sahw, he's done both salams, assalamu alaikum, and then he remembers. So if he remembers before he's done an action that would invalidate the prayer, he'll do the Sajdah Sahw, and that's fine. And if he's done it after doing such an action, then he'll have to repeat his namaz within the time. Yes. No, it would invalidate. Yes. No, you can't do that. You can't do that. Next thing. Okay, next masala where it says that's how would be necessary now. This masala is very tricky. Yes. Well, there's something called ittisal saf. So ittisal saf is basically where the safs have to be connected. And there's a certain amount, if it's more than 3 safs gap, now I don't want to go into this masla fully right now, but if there's more than 3 safs gap, then the namaz won't be valid. So the safs have to be connected. So there's an example of this, big debate on this rather, or masala on this, is those that are in Makkah Sharif, can they read from their hotel? They can hear the namaz, they're in their hotel, they're so high up they can even see it as well, they can see everything. Will their namaz be valid or not? So now the muftis have written this principle which I've mentioned, is it depends if the safs are connected up to their hotel. So Allah maaf kare, but there's so many people on the streets that wherever their hotels are quite far, you can hear the noise, but there's no connection of the safs. You just see the Baba is in the lobby, hotel lobby. He's just in the hotel lobby and he's reading with the Imam. But there's no connection of the safs, that's why it'd be incorrect. So that's the reason behind that. So the next masala I was saying, this is a very tricky masala. I wouldn't generally mention this masala unless somebody asks me, but because we're doing a fiqh class, inshallah I'll mention it. I'll try my best to explain it. So just try and listen carefully. Hopefully it's not that tricky, but yeah. So it's about having doubts in the number of rakats. What should you do if you have doubts in the number of rakats? Have I read 1 rakat? Have I read 2 rakats? Have I read 2 rakats or have I read 3 rakats? So the first thing to consider is if this is the first time something like this has occurred. So if it's the first time you're having doubts, the scholars say you will just repeat your namaz again. You'll redo your namaz again. But if somebody is a victim of these doubts repeatedly, then what should he do? There are 2 rulings. Number 1, when he has this doubt, he has a ghalib guman. He has a overpowering thought, an overpowering thought. That, for example, is it my first rakat or second rakat? Your overpowering thought is that it is second rakat. You go with your overpowering thought, and that's it. second rakat or third rakat, overpowering thought for some reason, yeah, I remember reading it, but I'm not too sure. Your overpowering thought is that it's the third rakat, you go with the third rakat. Now, the next scenario is when a person doesn't have a overpowering thought at all. Now, this is where it gets tricky. If a person has no overpowering thought, he will consider it to be the lower number of rakats from the two, but he will also give consideration that it could be the higher of the two. So you'll understand this better from the example that I will give in a minute, but I'll repeat that one more time. That when a person has a doubt in the number of rakats and he has no overpowering thought, he will consider it to be the lower of the two rakats, whichever one he's having doubts in, is it one or two? He will consider it to be the first rakat, but he will also give consideration to the fact that it could also be the second rakat. What does this mean? You'll understand through this example. So we'll go again with the same example of it being first rakat or second rakat. No overpowering thought. You are now going to consider this to be your first rakat. And after, so you were in the sajdah of the first rakat, for example, and you're thinking, is this my second rakat? Is this my first rakat? You will think it to be your first rakat. However, you won't stand up for the second rakat. After you've completed that first/second rakat, you will sit down and you will read at-tahiyyat, because it's very possible it's your second rakat as well. So you're going to sit down. Even though you're classing it as your first rakat, you're sitting down after that first rakat in at-tahiyyat. When you're reading at-tahiyyat, because there's a possibility it could be your second rakat. Now you're going to read your second rakat and then you're going to sit down. Even though in one possibility it could be the third rakat, but you've sat down. After you complete the third rakat, what do you think you're going to do? You're going to sit down and read at-tahiyyat again. Even though we are considering it to be the third rakat, we're giving consideration it could be the higher of the two rakat, and we're going to sit down because it could be our fourth rakat. And remember, the sitting of the fourth rakat is farz, so we're going to give consideration to that. And then at the end, we read the one more rakat, we sit down, and what do you think we're going to do at the end? Sajdah Sahw, for many reasons. So I'll put it under here, delay of one posture. There could be many different reasons why we class that or rule it in that scenario for Sajdah Sahw to be necessary. So it's a bit of a tricky masla, but hopefully from there you'll have understood what I mean by you consider it to be the lower rakat, but also give consideration to the second rakat. So if it was in this, for example, in the second rakat, now you're not sure if it's the second rakat or the third rakat. So you're going to sit down, consider it to be your second, but then later on you'll also sit down when it's possibly the fourth rakat, and you do sajdah sahw. It's very important in certain masail like this as well that you don't give in to your doubts, because when a person becomes a victim of these doubts, then he all the time, that's all he's doing, he's repeatedly doing sajdah sahw. So you've got to be mentally strong, try and keep yourself mentally present as well. And then at times there's a hadith as well that sometimes when these doubts are just so much, you just say to yourself and to shaitan, you know what, my namaz isn't valid, I don't care, my namaz isn't done. And that way you get rid of those doubts. So it's very important we don't become victim to these doubts. Yes. Well, again, the wajib actions which we mentioned before, they have to be performed calmly in a calm manner. If they were left out accidentally, then sajda will be okay at the end. But if a person rushes and he misses, he doesn't even go in the action for the duration of one tasbih on purpose, then the namaz won't be done. Then you should repeat that namaz later on. The namaz won't be done. So you have to, you're obviously certain. For example, you're giving me the example of work. That's not a major emergency in reality. The haqq and the right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes first. You read your namaz, you make yourself, as in you give priority and you seek for such a job where they allow you to read your namaz 5 minutes, 10 minutes. What's 10 minutes? You seek a certain employment and a certain job that allows you to read. So that's your right, and that's your responsibility and duty to seek such an employment. Okay. So that was just a few examples of forgetting or a delay of one posture rather. Number 11, forgetting the kabir of kunut. Okay. So now we're talking about the witr wajib, the 3 rakat witr wajib. After, when you're in the third rakat, you've read Surah Fatiha, you've read your surat, what you meant to do? You meant to do the takbir of kunut and then read dua kunut. So Allahu Akbar. Now if a person forgets that Allahu Akbar and they just in this scenario that we're making up, he forgot the Allahu Akbar and he just started reading dua kunut. So لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد, and he just forgot اللهم إنا نستعينك ونستغفرك. So he's forgot to say Allahu Akbar. Sajdah Sahw will be necessary. Now note that the actual raising of the hands is sunnat. So if a person said Allahu Akbar, but he just forgot to raise his hands, then the namaz is valid, because the raising of the hands is sunnat muakkada. Like we mentioned in the faraz, that takbir tahrima, the first Allahu Akbar that you do, and you raise your hands, the raising of the hand at that time is sunnat. The actual phrase Allahu Akbar, that is what is faraz. So here, the phrase Allahu Akbar is wajib, the actual action is sunnat. This is why the scholars say, now for me to mention this ruling, you're going to have to understand a bit of an introduction and a background, is qaza namazes. When we do qaza namazes, which namazes do we do qaza for? All of our faraz namazes, just the faraz. So 2 faraz, 4 faraz of Zuhr, 4 faraz of Asr, 4 faraz of Isha. But along with that, we also have to do qaza of the 3 rakat witr wajib. So many people forget this. They only do it of the 5 faraz and they don't do it of the 6 3 rakat witr wajib. To the extent that if a person passed away and you were giving fidya on their behalf, or within their lifetime they decided to give fidya for the missed namazes, then they will also give it on on behalf of all 6. So the 5 faraz namazes, and number 6 the witr wajib as well. As for the sunnat namazes, you don't do qaza of them later on. So what do you do qaza for? The 5 faraz, and number 6 witr wajib as well. So you have to do qaza of witr wajib. So the ruling I was mentioning, that raising the hands is sunnat. So based on this, the scholars say that if you are reading your 3 rakat witr wajib qaza in a congregation, in an area where people are around you, you shouldn't raise your hands when you're doing the qaza of the 3 rakat witr wajib. So Allahu Akbar, you're doing qaza, everybody's going to look at you and they'll see and they'll acknowledge that you are reading your qaza of wajib. And we mentioned this earlier, that if a person realizes this is you exposing yourself, that you've missed a namaz that was necessary upon you. You are exposing yourself that you committed a sin. So this is why you shouldn't raise the hands. All you say, you're reading the 3 rakat witr wajib, you've read your surah, Allahu Akbar. You just say Allahu Akbar without raising the hands if you're doing qaza in such an area where other people might see you. Ji. Mr. Ruku, you'll have to listen back a few weeks. We mentioned this. So I'll mention it quickly. If a person misses ruku, he's in sajdah, he's just going to go back up into ruku, and he'll repeat the 2 sajdas, and he'll do sajdah sahw at the end. So it's simple that if you remember, whilst you're in sajdah, you go straight back into ruku, and even if you had done 1 sajdah before, after the ruku you do 2 sajdas again, and at the end you do sajdah sahw because you call the delay. Yes. Well, this is coming now. Number 12, forgetting dua kunut. So one is the Allahu Akbar, to say Allahu Akbar, and the next for us is the dua of kunut, to read dua kunut. So generally what happens is if you miss Allahu Akbar, you also miss the dua as well. So lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad, and they've gone straight into ruku, just thinking that it's the first rakat, second rakat, or it's some other namaz. They've completely forgotten the dua kunut. Then it's a wajib, and sajdah sahw will have to be read at the will have to be done at the end. There's another scenario, is if you remembered you missed dua kunut whilst you're in ruku. or whilst you're in coma. So you're in ruku and you just remember that I just missed dua kunut, or you've stood up from ruku and you remember that you missed dua kunut. Now the reason we're mentioning this, and I'm going to ask you guys if you remember from last week or the week before that, we mentioned the ruling of if you missed Surah Fatiha and then you remembered in ruku or you remembered in qoma, what should you do? Can anybody remember? Yeah, so you're going to go back into the standing position and you'll just read Surah Fatiha again. You forgot that you read a surat whilst you were in ruku position or coma position, and you'll go back into the standing position, you read Surah Fatiha again, you read your surat again, and then you'll do the ruku again. We mentioned all the details previously, that's why I don't want to go, mention it step by step or repeatedly, but that's what you do then. So now what about if you remember you missed dua kunut whilst you're in ruku or you're in coma? Based on the previous two rulings, you'd probably say that you'd go stand back up and do dua kunut again, but the answer is no. In dua kunut, you don't do that. In dua kunut, once you've missed it and you've gone into ruku, you'll suffice with sajdah sahw at the end. So you don't get back up or you don't read the dua kunut in ruku. You'll just do sajdah sahw at the end. Khalas. Any questions? Yes? Yes. Yeah. There'll be no sajdah sahw necessary. Okay, that again, or you like the folding of the hands and stuff like that, that is sunnat, so it's not something that's wajib, etc. Even though it's better not to do it, but it's fine. Yes. Yes. It protects you from Jahannam. But only questions related to the session, please. Yes. Well, probably based on that, I'd say if you're closer to standing or if you're closer to ruku. And we've mentioned this. Can anybody remember from a few weeks ago? I mentioned what is the bare minimum for ruku to be for it to be called ruku. So the question asked for those people online, I received a bit of feedback last time, is that I don't mention the questions out aloud so they don't know what's going on. So sorry, I've probably missed out a few questions. But the question is if you are um, if you're going into ruku and then you remember you missed dua kunut, you're still not in ruku, what should you do? So now I'm asking you guys a question that I mentioned a few weeks ago. What's the minimum amount of bowing for it to be called ruku? No. The minimum amount of bowing for it to be called ruku. So the minimum amount for ruku to be called ruku is when the hands touch the knee. When the hands touch the knees and you've gone down that much, then it's called ruku. Okay, so assuming on that, and I've not read this anywhere, but if you remembered before this, then you will read the dua kunut. And if your hands have gone down that much that they're touching the knees, then now you're officially in ruku. Scenarios in which sajda sahw is not necessary. Number 1, delay of 3 tasbeehs due to coughing or sneezing. So a person has flu, achoo, 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 achoo. He's done about 4 or 5 achoos in a row, and it happens sometimes when you have a bad flu or you have hay fever and you're not able to read anything at all, and the extent of 3 or the duration of 3 tasbeehs has passed, then even then sajda sahw will not be necessary. Such a reason is excused by the Shariat. So if you cough or sneeze or due to hiccups and there's a delay of 3 tasbeehs, sajda sahw will not be necessary. Now, I'm not sure if I mentioned this last week. I'm pretty sure I did, about Surah Fatiha, about repeating Surah Fatiha. That if you repeat Surah Fatiha, then sajda sahw will be necessary. And I mentioned the amount. If you read past this amount, sajda sahw will be necessary. So if a person reads only one verse and he repeats only one verse of Surah Fatiha in those rakats in which Fatiha is wajib in, then there'll be no sajda sahw. So an example of this, Maliki Yawmiddin, and he has a doubt for some reason that, oh, I didn't read it properly, and he just repeats it again, there'll be no sajda sahw. Repeating Fatiha in the third and fourth rakat of a farz. So we mentioned if a person omits Surah Fatiha in the first rakat and he doesn't remember it after the sajda, okay, if he remembers before the sajda, we mentioned the ruling, but he remembers after the sajda, should he repeat the Surah Fatiha in the third and fourth rakat? No, he shouldn't. But if a person accidentally, because of that masla, or just generally in the third and fourth rakat of a farz, he repeats the entire Surah Fatiha twice. He reads Surah Fatiha twice, so the sahw will not be necessary. And also on that, we did mention it last week, but we'll remind ourselves again, is if a person in the third and fourth rakat of a farz, he accidentally read a surah as well, then there will be no sajda sahw. Repeating at-tahiyyat, durood, dua in the final sitting. In the final sitting. In the first sitting, if a person repeats at-tahiyyat, or he reads, like we just mentioned today, he reads up to ala ali Muhammadin, the second Muhammad, then he's caused the delay of the posture of standing up to the third rakat. So now sajda sahw will be necessary. But in the last sitting, if he accidentally repeats at-tahiyyat twice, or he repeats durood sharif twice, or he reads more than one dua, there is no sajda sahw. The reason for this is because he's not causing a delay to any posture. Now there should be a question in your mind when I've just said this last phrase, that is not causing a delay to any posture. Does anybody have any questions? Think about one of the wajibs we mentioned today. So if a person in the last sitting repeats at-tahiyyat, repeats durood, repeats dua, I'm saying there's no sajda sahw necessary because there's no delay to a wajib, to a rukn or to a wajib act. Now I am saying that there should be a question in your mind, there should be an objection in your mind. No. There's a wajib act left. What's that wajib act left? To say as-salam. So to say as-salam is wajib. Now when a person repeats at-tahiyyat, he repeats at-tahiyyat accidentally, he's causing a delay to the wajib of assalamu alaikum in one sense. That should be the objection that comes to your mind. But the answer is that no, he's not causing a delay to the assalamu, to the salam. Why? Because in the final sitting, there's no limit to the amount that you can read. So you can carry on reading one dua, two duas, three duas, although in farz namaz, you should restrict yourself to just one dua, keep it very short, okay? But in nafil namazes, you can read many duas, so that's why there's no limit to what you can read in that final sitting, hence why there is no delay in the salam. So I hope you understood that. That was just me trying to open your minds up very slightly if possible, just to see if you understood. Repeating Du'a Qunut. Okay, if a person repeats Du'a Qunut, says that sahw will not be necessary. Why? Because again, there's no limit to the amount of reciting the amount of du'as in the Du'a Qunut. So you can read the Du'a Qunut, you can read other variants of Qunut as well according to the other mazhabs. You can read any other du'as as well, although the sunnah is to read Allahumma inna nasta'inuka. Next thing which doesn't necessitate sajda sahw is not reading surahs in order. So now before I mention this, I'd request you guys to get a Quran Sharif because we're just going to be doing some rules of recitation now. So you'll understand better if you have a Quran Sharif in front of you and you have the last few surahs before you. You'll help to understand the masalas. So I'll give you a minute to just grab a Quran Sharif if you'd like. It's okay, inshallah, you can listen to it. Just open to the last few pages, inshallah, from Alam Tara Kaifa. Yeah, I don't know. It's the last few pages. Just let me know once you've got the last few pages. Alam tara kayfa fa'ala rabbuka bi ashabil fil on that page. Okay. So not reciting surahs in order. So for example, you're all on Alam tara kayfa right now. If a person reads Alam tara kayfa fa'ala rabbuka bi ashabil fil in the first rakat. Now that person, he shouldn't read Wailul Likulli. The surah before it, he shouldn't read Wailul Likulli in the second rakat. He shouldn't read Wal Asri or anything before that, he shouldn't read in the second rakat. If you read Alam Tara Kayfa in the first rakat, in the second rakat you will read Lila fi Quraysh. I'll mention the ruling of why you shouldn't read Ara'ayta alladhi. We'll carry on. You can read Inna Atayna, you can read Qul Ya al-Kafirun, you can read any other surah after Alam Tara Kayfa. So Lila fi Quraysh till the end. And Ara'ayta alladhi is an exception which I'll mention the reason before we finish today. So the same would apply, for example, in the first rakat, you read something from the 10th para. Okay? In the second rakat, you can read anything from the 10th para onwards, 11th para, 15th para, 21st para, 23rd para. But in the second rakat, you won't read anything from the first 10 paras. You won't read anything from 5th para, from 4th para, from 3rd para. Okay, so this is the sequence of the Quran Kareem. How the order of the Quran Kareem is from Alif Lam Mim to Qul A'udhu bi Rabbin Nas. That is the order that you will read in. So if you read Idha Ja'a in the first rakat, you will read anything that comes after it. In the second rakat, you won't read anything that comes before it. If a person did do so, then Sajdah Sahw will not be necessary. Although reading surahs in order is a wajib, you'll hear this is a wajib. However, it's not from the wajibats of the salah itself, it is from the wajibats of recitation. So Sajdah Sahw will not be necessary. So for example, if somebody read Alam Tara Kayfa in the first rakat and then they read Wailul Likulli Humaza in the second rakat, the surah before it, Sajdah Sahw will not be necessary. However, doing so intentionally in a faraz namaz and in a wajib namaz is makruh tanzihi. It is somewhat disliked. And some scholars say it's makruh tahrimi, meaning it's severely disliked. And if a person does it forgetfully, completely forgets, okay, he's read Alam Tara Kayfa in the first rakat, when he stood up for the second rakat, he started reading Wailul Likulli because he didn't even remember that he read Alam Tara. When he started that Wailul Likulli, he didn't remember that I had read Alam Tara in the first rakat, then in that scenario, it's not even makruh. It's not even disliked to read Wailul Likulli. So if you do it forgetfully, it's not even makruh. You do it intentionally in a faraz or wajib namaz, then it is makruh, it is disliked. If you do it in Sunnat and Nawafil prayers, it is permissible. It is not even disliked in those scenarios if you did it intentionally. So that is the first thing to remember. Now, number 2, switching from surat upon remembering that you have read against the sequence. So, with the example that we have been giving, in the first rakat you read Alam Tara Kayfa Fa'ala Rabbuka. In the second rakat, you started the second rakat and you read Wailul Likulli. You just read wail. You just read one word or even one letter. Wait, what? You just read one letter or one word from Wailul Likulli. You've remembered now that I read Alam Tara Kayfa in the first rakat. Should you now go to Li'ila fi Quraysh or any surat afterwards, or should you continue with Wailul Likulli? So the answer is, like I just mentioned a minute ago, that when you forgetfully do this, it's not even disliked. If you forgetfully read Wailul Likulli, it's not even disliked. That's why when you read one word of Wailul Likulli and it was done forgetfully, now you should just continue with Wailul Likulli. Now you won't switch surahs. Now you won't go to Ila fi Quraysh. Your intended surat when you were standing up was Li Ila fi Quraysh, but you accidentally read Wailul Likulli. Once you've started Wail, you read the one word, you read one letter, now you should just continue with it. Now you don't switch surahs. And if you did switch surahs, now you've done an act which is makruh. Okay. Number 3. Accidentally reading Surah Nas in the first rakat may happen. Okay, you read Qul a'udhu bi rabbin nas in the first rakat. What should you do? So the answer is, if it is a faraz namaz, you'll carry on with Surah Nas in that first rakat, and in the second rakat, you'll also read Qul a'udhu bi rabbin nas. So you'll read Qul a'udhu bi rabbin nas in both rakats. If it was a sunnat prayer, you read Qul a'udhu bi rabbin nas in the first rakat, you're going to repeat Surah Qul a'udhu bi rabbin nas in the second rakat, third rakat, and fourth rakat. Because obviously if you go back, now you're going to have committed a makruh act, because you'll have read against the order. And the rule of changing surat upon remembering. So you started Qul a'udhu bi rabbin nas in your first rakat, Qul a'udhu, and straight away Qul a'udhu bi rabbin nas, you said the full thing, because Qul a'udhu you can still go to Qul a'udhu bi rabbil falaq. So you read Qul a'udhu bi rabbin nas, and then you remembered it's my first rakat. Should you switch and go to another surat, Qul a'udhu bi rabbil falaq, or surat above? Yes or no? No, you shouldn't, because it's the same ruling as the one we just mentioned earlier, that if this is done forgetfully, it's not even makruh. If a person did this intentionally in a faraz namaz, it's makruh tanzihi. But if he's done it forgetfully, then it's not even disliked whatsoever. So you'll just continue with Qul a'udhu bi rabbin nas in that rakat and Qul a'udhu bi rabbin nas in the remaining rakats. No problem. No, they've got the Quran Sharifs because we've told them to. No problem. Jazakallah. Number 4. A person only knows one surat. What should they do? So the answer is, they will read that one surat in all the rakats, and it won't be disliked for them to do so, because they only know one surat. However, they should learn more surats in the meantime. So this is only a temporary stop. Whilst they only know one surat, they will read that one surat, but in the meantime, they will make an effort to learn more surats. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I don't think so. No. Yeah. No, not that I've come across anyway. Especially with the hadith that upon every letter of the Quran you'll get, for every letter you'll get 10 rewards. So according to that rule, I wouldn't think so, because you're just reading, you'll still be rewarded. Sorry? Yeah. Well, we'll leave that one. No, we've still got a few more surahs to go over, so inshallah we'll just mention that. Number 5, leaving a gap of one surat between rakats. Okay, so back to our example in Alam Tara Kayfa. The surat after Alam Tara Kayfa is Li Ila fi Quraysh. If a person reads Alam Tara Kayfa in the first rakat, omits Li Ila fi Quraysh, and then in the second rakat reads Ara'ayta alladhi, he has omitted a small surat. Doing so intentionally is makruh. You shouldn't omit a small surat. It will be makruh to do so. However, if it was done forgetfully, then that's a separate matter. There is one exception to this, and that is when the surah that is being left out, it is longer than the surah that was read in the first rakat. So the example of this is Li'ila fi Quraysh. A person reads Li'ila fi Quraysh in the first rakat. Now this is where we will see how well you know your Arabic numbers. How many ayats, verses are there in Li'ila fi Quraysh? There are 4 verses in لِإِيلَافِ قُرَيْشٍ. And how many verses are there in أَرَأَيْتَ الَّذِي Surah Ma'un? 7. So the principle is, if there is more than, or if there's 3 or more verses gap between the first surah and the second surah, you shouldn't read that second surah. You shouldn't lengthen that second rakat over the first rakat by more than 3 ayats. Okay? If it was less than this, then it'll be permissible. You'll understand this in a minute. I'm going to mention this in the next one. But just remember the principle that 3 verses, if the second surah or the surah being read in the second rakat is longer than the surah that was read in the first rakat by 3 or more ayats, then it will be makruh. Okay, so if this second surah is longer, it will be permissible, as in it was longer by 3 ayats or more in a small surah, then it'll be okay to omit it. So for example, you read لِإِيلَافِ قُرَيْشٍ, أَرَأَيْتَ الَّذِي is bigger by 3 ayats or more than لِإِيلَافِ قُرَيْشٍ. So now you omit it and you read إِنَّا أَعْطَيْنَا. That will not be makruh. So you've omitted one small surah, but it won't be makruh. Why? Because you are saving yourself from lengthening the second rakat over the first rakat. Yes. 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 So this applies to all the small surahs. So now you'll see, for example, if a person read Inna A'tayna in the first rakat and they read Qul huwallah in the second rakat. Now if you look at it in terms of lines, Inna A'tayna is smaller, it's the smallest surah in the Holy Quran, and then the second Qul huwallahu ahad, it is longer than Inna A'tayna. Now many people have this misconception, they know half of the rule, they know that you shouldn't read a smaller surah in the first rakat and a longer surah in the second rakat. But the principle is, if it is longer by 3 ayats or more. So to read Inna A'tayna in the first rakat and then to read Qul huwallah in the second rakat, it's fine because there's no gap of 3 ayats or more. Yes? Number 6. Combining 2 surahs or more in one rakat. So in the first rakat, I want to read أَرَأَيْتَ الَّذِي يُكَذِّبُ بِالدِّينِ, and along with it, I also want to read Inna A'tayna Kal Kawthar. So the answer is that it will be makruh if you join 2 surahs or more in which there is a gap of a surah or more than a surah. So you do أَرَأَيْتَ الَّذِي يُكَذِّبُ بِالدِّينِ with إِذَا جَاءَ. You've left surah in the middle. Then it'll be makruh. And if you just join أَرَأَيْتَ الَّذِي with Inna A'tayna, then in a faraz prayer, it will be suboptimal. It will be khilaf awla. You're allowed, there's no sajdah sahw, and khilaf awla suboptimal is lower than makruh tanzihi. So you'll have khilaf awla suboptimal, then you'll have makruh tanzihi slightly disliked, then you'll have makruh tahrimi. So to combine 2 surahs in one rakat is suboptimal in a faraz namaz. In nafil namaz, it's fine. But if, like we said, if there was a gap of a surah or more, then it'll be makruh. So you read أَرَأَيْتَ الَّذِي, and then straight after reading أَرَأَيْتَ الَّذِي, you started reading إِذَا جَاءَ or تَبَّتْ يَدَا or قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ in the same rakat. Now it's makruh. Number 7. Splitting one surah in 2 rakats. Now, if you read half a surah in one rakat and in the second rakat you read the same surah, as long as you did not omit one ayat in between, it's fine. There's no karahat. It's not disliked to do so. But if you omitted one ayat in between, now in the small surahs, it is better to read a full surah in every single rakat. But if it's a slightly bigger surah and you want to break it into 2 parts, so as long as you don't omit one ayat in between, you just skip just one ayat, then it'll be makruh. So if an example would be, if you want to go to a slightly longer surah, wal adiyati, probably be easier in that. So if you just want to open wal adiyati dabha, وَإِنَّهُ لِحُبِّ الْخَيْرِ لَشَدِيدٌ. Okay, that's where you read up to in your first rakat. وَإِنَّهُ لِحُبِّ الْخَيْرِ لَشَدِيدٌ. And in the second rakat, you miss out أَفَلَا يَعْلَمُ إِذَا بُؤْثِرَ مَا فِي الْقُبُورِ. You just miss that out, and when you start the second rakat, you just start from وَحُصِّلَ مَا فِي الصُّدُورِ. So you've left that one verse out. You didn't read that in the first rakat, you didn't read that in the second rakat, you omitted that one ayat in between, then it's makruh. And if you omitted more than one ayat, two ayats or more, then it's fine, then it's not makruh. Okay? But like I say, it's better to read one full surah in every single rakat. Okay, and we mentioned making the second rakat longer than the first rakat. So we mentioned the principle that in small surahs, it's how many ayats? 3 ayats. That if the surah read in the second rakat is longer by 3 ayats or more than the surah read in the first rakat, then it will be disliked. And if it was less than 3, then it'll be fine. So one where it's completely obvious is, for example, you read Wal Asr in the first rakat. How many ayats in Wal Asr? 3 verses. Yeah, 3 verses in Wal Asr. And how many verses in the surah after it? Wailul likulli? 9. Now how many ayats gap is there? There's 6 gaps. So what do you think? If you read Wal Asr in the first and Wailul likulli in the second, will it be makruh? Yes, it'll be makruh. Okay, because there's more than a 3 ayats gap. Yes, you can make that one surah gap. Yes. Yeah. Consecutively. Or, for example, you leave more than one surah, 2 surahs in between, then it's fine. So, that was that. So, we mentioned the ruling of Surah Kawthar in the first rakat and Surah Ikhlas in the second rakat. And if it wasn't a small surah, there are long surahs, or you will see as well that if the ayats of both the surahs that are being compared, if the ayats vary in their range and their size, then you won't compare the actual number of ayats, you'll actually compare the letters. Okay, an example of this is if you open Alam Nashrah and Surah Bayyina, Lam yakun alladhina kafaru. Now Alam Nashrah will have 8 ayats if I am correct. Alam Nashrah should have 8 ayats, and Surah Bayyina, Lam yakun alladhina kafaru min ahli al-kitabi, that will also have 8 ayats. But Alam Nashrah is only 4 lines, Lam yakun alladhina is about 10, 11 lines. So we're not going to look at lines in this scenario. When the ayats, the size of the ayats, they vary and they're not similar to one another, then you look at the number of letters. Now how do I explain this? I'll mention it through a number. If the first ayat, in the first rakat, for example, you read 50. You read 50 letters in total. In the first rakat, 50 letters in total. And in the second rakat, you read 74. There is less than double the gap, then it's fine. But if it was 76, then it won't be allowed. Now, obviously, who's going to count all the letters? This is why some scholars have said, if the gap is just obvious, it's clear, bayin ho. If it's clear, then it'll be makruh. And if it's not clear, then it's fine. But in Surah Alam Nashrah and Lam yakun alladhina kafaru, although both ayats are 8, you won't say, okay, yeah, you can read Alam Nashrah in the first, you can read Lam yakun alladhina in the second. No, because Lam yakun alladhina is a lot longer than Alam Nashrah. In that scenario, we will look at the number of letters. That which is established from the Prophet ﷺ is exempt from this ruling. So if there's certain hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he lengthened the second rakat over the first rakat, those surahs are exempt from this ruling. The same ruling would apply to wajib, sunnat and nafil prayers according to the correct opinion. Important to remember is in a 4 rakat prayer. In a 4 rakat prayer, the first 2 rakats will be considered separately, and the third and fourth rakat will be considered separately. Therefore, if the third rakat is longer by 3 ayats or more than the first rakat, is fine. Because the first rakat and second rakat will be considered one, third and fourth rakat will be considered one. So remember that ruling as well. That the third rakat, if it's longer than the first rakat by 3 ayats or more, that's still fine. So some of the combinations that I have worked out that won't be allowed would be Suratul Asr, Surah Humaza, Surah Asr, Surah Ma'un, Surah Quraysh, Surah Ma'un, Surah Teen, Surah Alaq, Surah Qadr Inna Anzalnahu, and Surah Bayyina Lam Yakun Alladhina, Surah Zilzal and Surah Adiyat, and Alam Nashra and Surah Bayyina. Okay, just try and remember that principle, but hopefully that's cleared a misunderstanding, because some people think, okay, if I've read Qul Huwallahu Ahad in the first rakat, then reading Qul A'udhu Bi Rabbil Falaq in the second, I'm making it longer. Even though there's less than the 3 ayats gap, it'll be allowed. Inna Atayna in the first, the shortest surah, so now I shouldn't be reading Inna Atayna in the first. It won't be makruh to do so. It won't be disliked to do so. And the last ruling is the ruling of reading Bismillah before a surah. So you read غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. You're reading Alam Tara Kayfa. Should you read the Bismillah before it? So the answer is that it won't be sunnat to read Bismillah before it, but it'll be better for you to read Bismillah before you start Alam Tara Kayfa. So it's not sunnat. So for example, the Bismillah before Surah Fatiha, you read when you're starting Surah Fatiha, to read Bismillah before reading Surah Fatiha, that is Sunnat. But to read Bismillah before starting the Surah, that isn't Sunnat, although it is better to do so. And just whilst we're on this topic about the Bismillah and reading Bismillah or not reading Bismillah, it's important to remember where this Bismillah is part of the Holy Quran. According to some school of thoughts, Bismillah that's written before the surahs, that is part of every surah. So every Bismillah is part of the Holy Quran. And according to us, the Ahnaf, the Bismillah that is written above every surah is not actually part of that surah. That Bismillah, it was sent down once. There was one Bismillah in the entire Quran that was sent down once, and that Bismillah, its purpose was to differentiate between every surah. So now at the start of every surah, we will read Bismillah, but the Bismillah only came down once. This is why you will see on the Taraweeh Khatam night that when you are doing the Khatam, the Imam, usually before Qul Huwallahu Ahad, he will read Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim loudly, because we believe that Bismillah is part of the Quran at least once. So that's why we read Bismillah loudly once before Qul Huwallahu Ahad on the Khatam night, because you can do that anywhere. So it's not necessarily just before Qul Huwallahu Ahad, but to read Bismillah loudly in the entire Quran once. When we're doing the Khatmi Quran, it's necessary to read Bismillah once. Whereas in other school of thoughts, the Bismillah before every surah is actually part of that surah. That is not the case for us. We don't believe that. We believe the Bismillah between every surah, it is actually just to differentiate that one surah has finished and another surah has started. So inshallah, that should have clarified majority of the rules regarding recitation. Alhamdulillah, we've clarified a lot about Sajdah Sahw as well. If you have any questions, inshallah, you can mention them. Any questions? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. So in fact, not only can you read it, if you missed the 4 sunnat of Zuhr, it will actually still be sunnat muakkada to read it after the farz of Zuhr as well. So within the time frame, you should read it. But once Asr time has started, now you don't do qaza of those 4 sunnahs. And I'm sure I mentioned about the 2 sunnat of Fajr as well in the first ever episode or session, that if you miss the 2 sunnat of Fajr for whatever reason, then you should try and make that up before istiwa time, before zawal time, before zohar time starts. Once zohar time starts, now you won't make those 2 sunnats up. Any question? Question?
I heard that if you
Yes.
record
Yes. So we've mentioned, alhamdulillah, we've mentioned these rulings in the first episode. I'll answer your question. We have 3 minutes left, so we might as well mention it. Is if the namaz time expires midway through the namaz. In all namazes, if the namaz time expires midway through the namaz will be valid apart from the faraz of Fajr. So if your Fajr finishes after the time has expired, midway through you're still reading and the time expires, then that Fajr will have to be repeated. All other namazes, if midway through the namaz time ends. So 7:30 is namaz end time. And 7:29 you started, and 7:31 you finished. In Asr, Zohar, Maghrib, Isha, your namaz will be valid. Although we're certainly not saying that is recommended or that is something you should do. We're just mentioning the legality and the ruling. So people, when they hear such ruling now, they start just taking benefits. Okay, you know what? I'm just going to delay my salah on purpose because I know it's valid. So you shouldn't take advantage of such things. These things that are being mentioned are in terms of whether your namaz has to be repeated or not, whether the namaz is valid or not. Doesn't mean you do this on purpose, but if you are in such a scenario, in all cases the namaz will be valid except the faraz of Fajr. And it's actually important that we remind ourselves about this masala as well. So many people nowadays with Asr time, they start their Asr very late in the masjid. There's a precaution window that we give here between Asr end time and between Maghrib start time. So there's one Asr end time. So for example, today Maghrib start time is 19:31. But if you check sunset time, sunset might be a few minutes earlier, 7:27. So Asr time would actually finish at 7:27. And people, they just look at the Maghrib start time and they delay up to there. So they should remember that in certain areas there is a precaution time between Asr end time and Maghrib start time. So keep that in mind. You shouldn't just delay it and think that okay, Maghrib time is at 31. Majority of the people, they give 2-3 minutes precaution. So the actual namaz time will finish earlier. So that's also something to remember when you delayed your namaz time. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala